The year was 1920, and a crazy new law was sweeping the nation. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act were both passed the year prior, but would legally go into effect on January 16, 1920. As the nation figured out how to navigate this new law and its enforcement, some states would seek out ways to get around this law. In particular, the state of Wisconsin would become one of the states that tried the hardest to work around the new law. Follow 4 UW-Green Bay history majors as they uncover Wisconsin's reaction to the emerging bans on alcohol and its enforcement in the beer capital of the United States. Through archival research and secondary sources, they'll explore the law's historical impact and its lasting legacy on the state and the nation.
We'll start with the story of vice that gives us a glimpse into some of the justifications or arguments used to support prohibition. This story we found in our archive research that combines several vices into a reason to ban alcohol. It included men seducing women, dancing, sex, corruption of minors, and drunkenness. The story is a perfect storm of the vices that people of the early 1900s blamed on alcohol. We know this story because it wound up in Shawano Court as a trial during May 1927 at Red Springs, Wisconsin. Here's how the story starts. 3 teenage girls run away from the Indian boarding school in May 1927 and hitched a car ride with 2 local boys in a local town. These boys dropped off the girls at a nearby farm that operated a bar out of the farmer's private home. At this bar, there were several adult men, the youngest being in his early 20s. These men served the girls alcohol. And then the girls started to listen to music that was being played. Then they started to dance the Charleston with each other. And before long, night arose. The girls stayed overnight, and based on the court testimony, at least one of the men had sex with one of these teenage girls. The following day, the girls left the farm, and they returned home. After this, we know that an arrest warrant was issued to the farmer who served the girls this alcohol from his home. During the trial, the prosecuting attorney made a considered effort to build the case that several vices were happening. It was dancing, it was minors, and sex, and of course, alcohol. And all these were combined into a case that emphasized vice. The farmer was found guilty on both counts for violating prohibition and for corrupting minors.
So I think it brings out a couple of different things that we today would find pretty appalling, like stuff we don't necessarily touch on in the rest of the podcast, like boarding schools. Not great. They're like just a lot of stuff that today we would like pretty much frown upon, but they were doing it back then for, I want to say, almost the wrong reason. Like they were trying to get at alcohol by saying like alcohol caused all this other stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's true, but that's what they were looking for. Yes,
alcohol caused all this. So
yeah,
that's why alcohol should be banned, because this was 27, so prohibition had been around for several years.
Yeah, I know.
That dang dancing, I'm telling you,
it's
just so evil.
The Charlestons was.
Oh my God!
That is my favorite part of that story. Is when you look in that court document, it specifically says they were doing the Charleston. Like they were dancing.
Yeah,
Charleston, bad. Like I love that. That's
the verbiage of that case. I remember you called that out. It was the orgy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
The drinking orgy.
The drinking orgy.
Perfect.
Now we can look into some of how prohibition started prior to this case. Right, Nick?
That's right. Welcome to Whiskey Secrets. Today we're delving into one of the most controversial laws that had a profound impact on Wisconsinites during the 1920s. We have our hosts here today, myself, Nick, Nathan, Justin, and Kylie. As we explore Wisconsin's evolving relationship with alcohol, it's important to understand how these early laws set the stage for the seismic shifts brought on by Prohibition just a few decades later. Prior to Prohibition, Wisconsin already had a complex relationship with the legalities of liquor. Beginning on January 1st, 1839, Wisconsin became the first state to pass a legal drinking age, making it illegal to sell liquor or wine to anyone under the age of 18. On January 1st, 1866, another law was passed to prevent the sale of beer, wine, or whiskey to minors. minor being defined as someone under the age of 21 as of January 1st, 1878. Now, I wrote all this down. I thought it was really interesting because today Wisconsin has the big bad reputation of being the drunkest in America, which
Because we are.
because we are, and that's true. But I found it really fascinating that back in the start of the state, and they're already trying to get a lid on it. You know what I mean? Like,
Because 48 was statehood.
Yeah.
So.
yeah. And so like almost from the start, they're trying to put limits on it. But on the legal roller coaster that is Wisconsin's drinking age is due in part to a pervasive culture of brewing. A significant portion of Wisconsin citizens in the late 1800s and early 1900s were first and second generation German immigrants who brought their knowledge, skills, and culture with them to America. In fact, the Owens Brewery in Milwaukee is considered to be the first brewery in Wisconsin, founded in 1840. By 1860, there existed an estimated 200 breweries in Wisconsin, 40 of which could be found in Milwaukee. By 1890, almost every community had at least one brewery. These breweries quickly became pillars of their communities. They partnered with local farmers, turning their surplus corn into whiskey. Breweries also often sponsored festivals, various sports teams, and even youth groups. This involvement in the community bolstered Wisconsin's burgeoning drinking culture. So despite what this deep-rooted brewing culture would indicate, not every Wisconsin citizen supported the lax laws around drinking. Many of Wisconsin's first settlers came from New England, where temperance and Puritan beliefs were the law of the land. Upon moving to Wisconsin, they brought those beliefs and cultural practices with them, which clashed violently with the robust drinking culture the German immigrants were accustomed to. What resulted was a protracted legal back and forth between two groups with diametrically opposed views on alcohol. In 1849, a law known as the Dram Shop Law was passed, which makes Wisconsin tavern owners responsible for costs associated with drunkards should they sell liquor to someone commonly known to be one. State Senator Frederick Horn is quoted at the time as saying the law was designed to, quote, keep the tippler himself as blameless as possible. Many a poor sinner may, by that doctrine, enter the kingdom of heaven, inasmuch as the devil who tempted him is the only one to blame in the matter, end quote. In plain terms, he is condemning the decision to shift the blame for the actions of drunks from the drunks themselves onto the tavern owners who sold to them. In response, a mob attacked the house of Senator John Smith, the man who sponsored this bill. The Dram Shop Law was replaced in 1851 with a more lenient bill.
So today this would be like if you get drunk outside of a bar,
Yeah.
that bartender or the bartender is now liable for you.
Right.
But this was their first attempt to control.
Right.
I feel like some states still have that in effect, though, where you have to make sure you're not over-serving your customers before they leave.
Well, I think that's
You know?
I think that's technically true everywhere. There just isn't a law
Correct.
that says they have to do it. That's just like a moral obligation, I would say. And another thing I love is this comes up later when you talk, Kylie, where it's like we're comparing liquor to the devil.
Well,
Like,
Yes.
yes.
I know it's like, wow.
Well, a lot of the organizations that were fighting for Prohibition had their roots.
Yeah, roots in Puritan, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. Undeterred, temperance activists continued to push back against the quickly cementing beer culture in Wisconsin. In 1854, several Sauk County women were jailed in Baraboo while trying to shut down taverns that were violating liquor license laws. In response, the state legislature passed a law prohibiting the manufacture and sale of liquor. This law was vetoed by Governor William Barstow, who reasoned, quote, I cannot see any propriety in depriving our citizens of the right to manufacture liquors or compelling them to go abroad for what they can with profit and advantage manufacture at home, end quote. All right, the final battle over liquor laws in Wisconsin before Prohibition kicked off in 1872. That year, the state passed the Graham Law, which once again made tavern owners financially responsible for what resulted from selling to known drunks. The Milwaukee community especially did not take kindly to this. Milwaukee's city attorney challenged the law, which was upheld by the state Supreme Court. When legal means failed them, Milwaukee's German population got organized. In 1873, they ousted the Republican Party that passed the Graham Law and elected more sympathetic representatives. Those new representatives then repealed the Graham Law, replacing it with a much more lenient law that encouraged towns and municipalities to work closely with breweries and taverns to prevent drunkenness. This compromise was found acceptable by the supporters of temperance, and it held all the way up to the beginning of Prohibition.
You can already tell there's this debate. Brewing, it's political. It's been politicized. Yeah. Brewing.
Yeah.
They're going back and forth. They're trying to control alcohol some way at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not only that, it's also flipping back and forth to who's responsible. Is it the breweries? Is it the bartender? Is it the individual themselves?
Yeah, and another favorite part of this section is, and I wish we could see some of this today, there was a group of people that saw something they really didn't like. They got together and they threw out an entire political party from the state.
Wisconsin's own Republican Party.
Yeah. I thought that was simply incredible.
And now we're going to get into passing. It's passed. The Prohibition law's passed, right?
So what does it do now?
After passing the Prohibition law, Wisconsinites almost immediately wanted to change it. In 1921, the state legislature wanted to go ahead and pass the Matheson bill, which would have replaced the current Muhlberger Act, basically the state's version of the national prohibition law. And this new Matheson bill, however, that would change significant legal terms like permit, intoxicating liquor, and non-intoxicating beverages. The bill was also going to provide that any permits issued shouldn't go to liquor law violators, makes sense, and that they're going to be inspected on a monthly basis. The bill would also give state agents more power in enforcing prohibition-related laws.
So what I appreciated about your research here was they were trying to find loopholes. Like,
Immediately.
What's the alcohol level? What's the ABV going to be? Can we adjust it? And then is there an exemption for it? All this kind of stuff, because you're talking about what does it mean to have a permit. So there were permitted uses.
Right.
And figuring out who could do it.
Right, yeah. So if we go to Chapter 165 of the Wisconsin State Statutes, that actually does specify like what exemptions already existed. And this was also at the national level too, though. So, for instance, doctors, dentists, they could have high content alcohol because they need to sterilize their equipment. But on the flip side of that, they could also prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes. So it was...
I kind of think of chugging the NyQuil is what
I mean...
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, so not only were doctors and dentists and like druggists exempt, religious exemptions were also in there as well. So like priests, rabbis, like the good old communion wine. Going back to the Matheson bill, though, there obviously the problematic portions of this bill, like we just identified. However, there were some good things to the bill that were proposed. One of them being at the federal level, if your vehicle was stolen to do like bootlegging operations, it would be seized indefinitely. This bill would provide that if a state agency seized your vehicle, it would be returned to you, assuming you didn't know of the operation going on. And then another part of this bill too, explicitly in the document that I read, one of the amendments that they were thinking about implementing was the raising of the ABV, like we mentioned earlier, from 0.5%, which was the national level, to 2.5%, which is quite the jump, honestly. Like that opens up a lot of doors, especially like for the state of brewing. Like a lot of near beer can come out of that jump from 0.5 to 2.5.
And I'm not sure how many people know near beer. I had to look that up when I first saw you bumping into it. So we would call that non-alcoholic beer today, right?
Right. So like your Busch NA, your Bud Zeros, stuff like that is all 0.5%.
There's a very, very tiny amount of alcohol.
Correct.
Yeah.
0.05%.
As far as the Matheson bill goes, though, it would eventually be vetoed by Governor John Blaine. Keep that name in your minds for a little bit later on. However, in his letter to the assembly, he lays out a couple of quotes that I pulled that really like target as to why he sent the bill back. So like, quote, "A good enforcement act will have the sympathetic assistance of the people. An espionage law which provides for spying on the home and family life would become repulsive, and the reaction of the people will endanger the success of any enforcement act." End quote.
That's a really powerful quote. I don't think most people, or at least me before researching this, kind of thought of prohibition as a surveillance mechanism, which is essentially what Blaine is saying is they're going to surveil people on the suspicion of alcohol.
Yeah.
And that he viewed that as an overreach of government.
So he's not wrong to say this is a very big spying mechanism on the American people. So that was a good bit of foresight on his part. Unfortunately, one man was not able to break the tide of.
He tried his best.
Yes. Yeah. Oh God, did he ever?
Another quote from the bill, or the letter, I should say, also includes. So he doesn't name the Anti-Saloon League per se. However, he does say that it had there was a lobby that had a very influential part in passing of this bill, and they wouldn't want it changed at all. Which, of course, as we would know, like per the reaction of the veto, like he straight up said, like, Anti-Saloon League, get out of here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, to end it all off in like one like final quote, would be. Quote, I repeat that any law on the subject of enforcement should be plain, definitive, easily understood, as brief as possible, and in conformity with the supreme law of the land. So what he didn't want was vague definitions, and for the Wisconsin state bill to go against the national prohibition bill.
Mm-hmm.
So.
What I really like how he said easily understood.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, that, and like going back to like the two bills too, like you don't want to have the federal government saying, hey, you can't do that. And then the state bill will just be like, oh, yeah, you totally can.
Yeah.
But speaking on the Anti-Saloon League, we have some history on that I think is important to understanding the context. So the Wisconsin Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1897, so way prior to this whole Prohibition era. And they had the goal of uniting anti-alcohol sentiment, enforcing temperance laws, and pushing for prohibition. So it was already on their mind prior to the whole political debate, which is why they stuck their nose in there kind of early. A year later, in 1898, the state chapter of the league was officially organized. As a part of the Anti-Saloon League of America, their mission was clear: to educate and persuade the public and lawmakers to support prohibition.
Yeah.
Although the league was officially nonpartisan, it worked closely with the evangelical Protestant churches, believing that eliminating the saloon would help restore a morally upright society. To further this cause, the league used a variety of tactics. They harnessed the power of church pulpits, organized rallies and political debates, distributed pamphlets and leaflets, and published their own journal, The American Issue, to help spread their message. Much like other state chapters, the Anti-Saloon League of Wisconsin was relentless in lobbying for prohibition laws. Like you stated, even though he never really said it was them, it was probably them. And they were also campaigning for political candidates who supported their cause. So one gentleman, a man named John Strange, he was aligned with the Anti-Saloon League. He actually owned a paper mill, and he sent a letter to the governor which says, "With all the power and pleading of my heart, I beg you to sign the Matheson bill. Many good lawyers have approved of its legal nature, and a mere difference of opinion as to minor features should not divide good men upon a question of just how to forestall the devil. No other transgression among the host of alcohol vipers has as little to claim longer license for evil doing as beer. Beer has 100 sins to answer for, where whiskey has one, and no good word can be said truthfully of whiskey. Let us all do that lies within our opportunity to drive beer out of politics and away from our state. Why not give the boys and girls of Wisconsin the benefit of all doubts and be on the safe side? Let us all forget factions and frictions upon other political matters, and be as decent people unite upon killing the most indecent thing in the story of Wisconsin life: beer. No good can come through wine." He quoted, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whoever is deceived thereby is not wise," end quote. It's just as true now as when the Bible was first written. So John, he also had his hands in the Bible. He was a religious man. He quoted the Bible in this, just like
He used lots of language, vipers.
He did. He was
devil.
He was very strong in his ways.
Well, again, we get back to liquor is the devil. Man, that's so funny, too. You would think the religious guy would leave wine alone.
And he said,
Yeah.
get it out of politics. He wanted to get alcohol out of politics. Well,
Yeah.
man, you're the one putting alcohol
He is.
into the political debate.
He was. So on the other side of the spectrum, the fight wasn't just about banning all intoxicating beverage. It was about whether people could continue brewing alcohol in the privacy of their own homes. So this caused a rift even among Prohibition supporters who argued about just how far the law should go. And one gentleman sent a letter in again to Governor Blaine about how he should have the right in brewing his own liquor. Mr. Alvin Kletsch wrote, "My dear Governor Blaine, the Matheson bill prohibiting the making of wine in homes is up for your approval or rejection as you may elect. I sincerely hope that you will wield this measure, for it should become a law. The farmers and the working man will be deprived of the only method of obtaining a glass of wine or beer which is now left to them. Those in like circumstances can still serve whiskey or wine upon prescription, but it is too expensive for a system of those who cannot afford to pay the doctor. I see no harm if those deserving to make wines of any kind through natural processes are allowed to do so. There may be a few who will violate the present law as making distilled liquor, but the Matheson bill will not stop them. They will go ahead just like the same to make illicit goods. The wines made from carrots, berries, grapes, or dandelions will at no time be drank to excess or cause death, for the reason they go through a railroad process of fermentation, and secondly, because they are not made in sufficient quantities to do harm. I do not believe the citizen, whoever he may be, should be robbed of the privilege of making the above if he desires them. Trusting that you will give this your most earnest and careful consideration, I beg to remain honored, sir. Very respectfully yours, Alvin." And he sent this from the Republican House, which I thought was interesting. I do.
Yeah, so he's like, well, the homebrew, we call them homebrew today, right? He's like, well, what about them?
And I always like that he mentions what they're made from: carrots, berries, grapes, or dandelions. I think that's sweet for some reason.
I like this inclusion because it's like a very normal man who is just saying, hello, I would like to continue to make wine in the privacy of my own.
Yeah,
Right. I'm not selling it. I'm not transporting it up into Canada or whatever. Like,
Right.
Well, and he said that it wasn't going to be drank to excess or cause death, which I always think is interesting.
right. Like the person who's making it takes the responsibility, and he's not selling it to a point.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that, and you could also tie that back into people's different cultures too. Like, there could be like a cultural aspect of making wine and just enjoying it
Yeah.
in the privacy of your own home.
Yeah, I know. But I think that leads us pretty well into talking about some of the actual court cases that came up
Yes.
during the...
So we all went through these huge bound archives of court records during Prohibition. Yes. And what we did was we put together the spreadsheet, which enabled us to do some analysis. So we found some general trends in our archival research about the enforcement of Prohibition in Northeast Wisconsin. Particularly, we looked at Brown County and Shawano County. And we also found outside these trends outliers in the case file archives that were unique in some ways, yet they still conform to a historical context about how Prohibition affected Americans and Wisconsinites. So our historical trends were drawn from about 100 criminal cases that each of us scoured through of Prohibition violations. And these trends point to conclusions about how Prohibition laws were enforced and who was most affected by the laws. So that Matheson bill and the other bills. These trends that we saw were about sex or gender. They were about immigrant ancestry or ethnicity. They were sentencing severity, and they were the law enforcement officials that were involved in enforcing Prohibition. So the first trend is about sex and gender, and what we found is by far men were most affected. Almost all the convicts were men. There were only 2 cases that involved women handling alcohol. One of those cases involved 3 girls of a minority. But even in these cases that involved women, men were the ones that were convicted. Rarely were women convicted. And that's striking to me because if half the population is women, then it's not clear this disproportionate conviction rate that is it targeting men, or is it simply that women didn't drink, or women were kind of, not looked at as potential for drinking or consuming.
Well, or were they not getting caught? Because if I remember, we did some slightly unrelated reading where during Prohibition, women were, as opposed to as a general trend, as opposed to going out to the speakeasies and the whatever else, they were having house parties. So I'm wondering if perhaps
Okay.
the women were too smart and low key to.
That's right. Women were smart. I love it.
What is the saying? If you don't get caught, then it's not.
Hey, everything's legal if you're never caught.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if maybe that's what was going on. Because I'm sure they were drinking, but I think
sneaky.
they were a little more slick about it. They weren't just going to their same old taverns being like, well, the law can't get me out here, Shawno. Yeah, so
Maybe so.
so
Another trend we found is that there were several ethnic groups in these cases with family ancestries, like Belgian, French, even non-immigrants who lived in Wisconsin for a while. But there was one ethnic group that kept on being affected in the cases, and that were the Germans. Convicts whose parents had immigrated from Germany, so these were first-generation, second-generation Germans, were the majority of Prohibition violations. They represented 60% of the cases tried in Brown County alone. And at this time, Wisconsin had a large German immigrant population, as you know, Nate.
Oh, yeah.
And by the early 1900s, they were still here. So we need to probably do more research to find out, were German Americans being targeted by these warrants? Why do they appear in the record? Or is it just the population of German immigrants, just as represented in the case file?
My guess would be as I established previously, there was a big brewing culture around these Germans, and my guess is they were just unable or unwilling to accept the change and just continued with life as it has
So
been.
it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, that they were not willing to give up.
Which we're guessing.
My guess.
Let's throw it out there because after this prohibition happens after World War I, and Germans were sometimes targeted. That whole Hun propaganda thing.
That is important.
So, but you make a good point. It might just be the population.
Yeah.
So finally, the two trends that we saw were about who enforced these laws, which I think this was a surprise for me at least. The one trend was that who was breaking the law, who was enforcing this law in the state of Wisconsin. And, well, we found all of our cases in local district courts. It was local law enforcement officials who were asking for the warrants. Local judges were issuing the warrants. So it was county district judges who heard the cases. It was county district attorneys who prosecuted the cases. There were no cases that we looked at that were tried in federal court, even though this was a federal law. And in Brown County, for example, we kept on seeing the same law enforcement officials, like this J.W. Martin guy. I know you tried to figure out who the heck he was.
Yes,
he kept on appearing over and over and over for the warrants. And he was a local.
Yeah. So these prohibition agents were a little tricky because there was not a ton of data available on them. So that's a direction we considered taking here, but just due to time and lack of data, we kind of decided not to. But it was, and I don't think he was the only one. I think there was a pretty popular guy up in Shawano County as well. F.B. Loves. He was up in Shawano. He was making a great. And another fun thing to note is these guys aren't making the arrests. It's like the sheriff or the whoever else that are making the arrests. They're just reporting.
And issuing warrants.
Reporting and issuing the warrants. So I don't know. It's because this is a state prohibition agency. Like, again, this comes back to this is not the federal.
Nope.
This is not the FBI coming down and arresting all sorts of people. This is a state mandated agency that is going out and looking for these violations.
Which is not what Hollywood typically portrays.
No,
it's like the FBI agent or the prohibition agent comes in who's a federal agent, and that's not what we found.
Yeah.
It's state and local.
Yeah, and I wonder if, because it ties back to how there's the federal prohibition law, but then the state also chooses to pass its own version of
Like the Matheson.
Yeah, and I wonder if that was perhaps there was some federal pressure applied because the federal government realizes we don't have the money or the resources to police all 50 states. So we're going to get them to look after themselves. So I wonder if that's what was going on.
And finally, on the trend for what these people did who are accused of violating prohibition, the bulk of the defendants pled guilty. They just didn't challenge it. And they were quickly sentenced. So once the judge convicted them, they were usually handed out a moderate sentencing. It was basically that pay the fine or do the time kind of motto. And in Shawano County, the district judge sentenced half of the convictions to a $100 fine or a short jail time if they couldn't pay the fine. Now, I did some numbers on that. $100 back in 1920 something, 21, I think, is about $1,700 in today's money, inflation adjusted. So it's not that it was like a slap on the wrist. I mean, there was a substantial amount of money. But at the same time, this was not a major crime that you were put in the slammer for years. This was you need to pay the fine or you might spend 30 days in the local jail.
Yeah. I think it also, that is representative of like the Wisconsin of pop culture, where it's like, we don't really care about this prohibition nonsense.
I also found some other stuff that was kind of interesting. In 1922, Governor Blaine also pardoned people that went to jail because of prohibition. Yes. And a lot of the justification for it was the fines were ridiculous at the time. Like some of them, like the trends were $100 fine, but others were like $500, $300, like
for the bigger,
right? Yeah. And he's even quoted in his speeches saying like, these men have like served their time, and there's people outside of the jail walls that need them more.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was a couple that he pardoned where it was a man was arrested and he served 4 months in jail, and now his wife on the outside and his 4 children are going into destitute, like they're on the way to poverty, and that's why he got them out of there. And he's like, stories like these like tug on my heartstrings as your governor. So like I'm doing what I can to like right the wrong.
This is actually the man who is later elected to Senate in 1926.
U.S. Senate,
to the United States Senate, and he is the one who repeals prohibition. So again, the Wisconsin to pop culture, we sent our champion to throw out this awful law, and he gets it done for us. So I think that's really fun.
So as we've seen today, Wisconsin's history with alcohol during Prohibition was complicated. From passionate temperance activists to rebellious bootleggers, the state's relationship with alcohol would forever be marked by this period of resistance and change.
It wasn't just about drinking itself. It was about freedom, culture, and identity. The state's brewing history, along with the fervent support for both prohibition and resistance to it, shows us how laws, no matter how sweeping, can never erase a deep cultural tradition.
And prohibition is still relevant today. Even today, laws seek to control the private spheres of individuals on the grounds of moral justifications.
Thanks for joining us on our episode of Whiskey Secrets. Consider doing your own reading for more stories about how Wisconsin's rich history shaped the nation. Until next time, keep your glass full and your curiosity flowing.
Well, with that, we should go get a beer.